All right, friends. So as we had communicated with you, today we are looking at the first Mishna of Tractate Shabbat, which, as you probably surmised, deals with the laws of Shabbat. Before we begin, some words of introduction are necessary. Everybody knows that on Shabbat, we may do no manner of work. In fact, that's one of the 10 commandments, is to observe the Shabbat. Now, the obvious question is, what constitutes, oh, there's somebody that's dragging their mouse over the text. So you've got to be careful, friends, you don't do that, because we can see that now on our page. The question is, what constitutes, Menashe? What constitutes work? Okay, can we avoid this of people, making this on the text? So we'll do something that you can sit relaxed and not worry. All right, that's erased. Now we're going to, oh, genius. Can we avoid the problem going forward?
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, folks, another few seconds. How do you know all this?
I'd have to turn it off for a second.
What's that? Host only. There you go. Okay. Let's get the screen back, the text back. Where we go. Okay. So the question is, what's the definition of work? Most of us would assume work means one of two things: physical exertion or making a living. Neither have anything to do with the essential definition of work on Shabbat. Rabbis work on Shabbat. Cantors work on Shabbat and holidays and Yom Kippur for that matter. That's their livelihood. So it isn't making a living. And as for physical exertion, this would not be in the spirit of Shabbat, but if you wanted essentially to carry a heavy chair up and down your stairs in your home on Shabbat all day, terrible waste of time probably, but no transgression of any biblical law. So what then is the definition of work on Shabbat? And how do we arrive at this definition? The answer basically is that for the most part, the command to observe Shabbat, well, this is a fact, not the most part. The command to observe Shabbat follows in the Torah a detailed description of the instructions to build the sanctuary for God and how, in fact, the Jews in the desert did so. Right after that elaborate description comes the prohibition not to work on Shabbat, from where we derive that the definition of work is any activity that went into making the sanctuary for God, the house for God. That's what's prohibited. And our sages enumerated all of the activities and arrived at the number 39. There are 39 labors, activities, that went into the construction of the Mishkan. Now, friends, what's common to all of those activities is the following. They're all demonstrations of man's mastery and manipulation of nature in one way or another, harnessing nature, controlling nature. So the definition of a forbidden labor is an intelligent act that demonstrates our mastery over nature. And that's a good thing. In fact, God told Adam and Eve that you should rule or master the world, but for 6 days only. On the seventh day, God says, hands off my world. You can set all your creative achievements up before Shabbat, but in other words, have your electricity going and what have you. But on Shabbat, hands off, because this is the one day to contemplate. Why? Why am I here? Why did God give me this divine intelligence? Why is it that I'm able to harness and discover and create and be creative? What's it all for? So Shabbos anchors us as to the purpose of our productivity and creativity, that it all be, or ought to be, for the purpose of developing the world physically and spiritually. So one day God says, do not be directly involved. Step back and withdraw inwards. Experience your own soul. Experience your family, relationships at this deep soulful level. So the word Shabbat, rearrange those letters, is the word tashuv, same Hebrew letters, which means to return. It's a day to transcend and return inwards. Shabbat is about being, not performing. And that's why, friends, Shabbat is the feminine day of the week. And it's the woman that ushers Shabbat into the world, because as we have discussed previously and many times, the difference between men and women essentially is men do, women are. The weekday is a male thing, fixing, tinkering, doing. Performance. Shabbat is the feminine day of the week. It's knowing God not for what he does, which is creation, but for who he is, which is far beyond even the incredible role of being creator and the divine artist of the universe. Far beyond that, being versus doing. So again, all 39 labors on Shabbat, which are of course enumerated at length in the Code of Jewish Law. And if you'd like to become familiar with these laws, and perhaps if you haven't already, decide to observe one of these laws and then slowly perhaps grow in your observance, or just familiarize yourself. There are many books available on the subject that guide us as to how to properly observe the Shabbat. Final introductory statement. We might define Shabbat as follows. Shabbat is the day where God says, I invite you to enter into a higher spiritual realm, to dine at my table, as it were. And here's the protocol. These laws, observing the laws of Shabbat, are the means by which we disengage the world and enter into this pristine, serene communion with God, dining, as it were, in the very palace at the king's table. That's what these laws are. It's the protocol. It's the attire. It's the state of mind. It's the state of being. These laws lift us to this experience, the heavenly experience of Shabbat, which our sages say is a foretaste of the Messianic era, which is described as the era of the great and eternal Shabbat. Now, here's the thing, friends. I just mentioned that all 39 labors, if you look at them, from writing to igniting a fire to all of the labors involved in agriculture, it's all an intelligently motivated act that's going to yield some benefit through our control, mastery of nature. But there's one law, and all of the 39, that doesn't seem to fit into that definition. And in fact, it's the law we're going to look at today. And it's the law which Tractate Shabbat opens with. In other words, as we learned, the Mishnah was arranged, compiled by Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, collecting all the teachings of the sages of the oral law in this orderly fashion, governing every area of Jewish law. He chose to begin the laws of Shabbat by this one law that doesn't seem to fit into the mold at all. And that, friends, is the law of carrying. And what is that? Briefly stated, on Shabbat, we may not carry from an enclosed area to an open area, or vice versa, irrespective of what it is you are carrying, any object, large or small. Simply carrying it from one domain and placing it in the other, that is what the Torah prohibits. Now, if you look at the quote on the page, there are several sources for this in the Torah. Here's one of them. Mark that the Lord has given you the Sabbath, or see, therefore he gives you 2 days food. On the 6th day, Moses is speaking to the people, and he's telling them, no manna is going to fall tomorrow on Shabbos. This was a Friday, and he tells them, because everybody was surprised that 2 portions of manna fell on Friday, and nobody could understand, nobody knew why. They hadn't been told about Shabbat yet. And so he's explaining it to them, and he's saying that you will observe Shabbat for the first time tonight and tomorrow. And that's why you're getting 2 portions of food today. That's the reason, friends, why, by the way, Al Challah Friday night, 2 chalot, which begin the meal, over which the Kiddush is recited. It's to remember the 2 portions of manna that fell on Friday, one for Friday and one for Shabbat. And the same occurred before every holiday. For the 40 years they were in the desert. Continuing the text, let everyone remain where he is, let no one leave his place on the 7th day to do what? To go out and collect the manna from out there and bring it into your tent, because there isn't going to be any manna. And here is the origin of this, one of the origins of the prohibition, to carry from an open area outside, an object, in this case the manna, into one's tent, into a closed domain. That's the essence of the law of Shabbat. Just for a moment, I'm going to look at, I guess it's this one. The laws of Shabbat, like all laws, I mean, they are simple, but at the same time, very complex in many details. So just to, I know we're pressed for time, but to give you an idea here of the 4 various domains that exist with respect to the laws of Shabbat. There are 4 categories of domains on Shabbat. The Reshut HaRabim, the public or open domain. Reshut HaYachid, the private or enclosed domain. The intermediate area called the Carmelit, and the exempt area called Makom Ptur. We'll just look at the first 2 because they're the primary. The first 2 domains are the primary ones as defined by the Torah itself. And the Carmelit is a rabbinically defined domain. And the Makom Ptur is no domain at all, actually. Let's quickly look at this. So, a Reshut HaYachid, what is meant by a private domain? It has little to do with ownership, although the sages did introduce that factor as well. We won't go into that dimension. But biblically, Reshut HaYachid, private domain, means simply enclosed. So hence the Eruv. The Eruv, which you've all probably heard of, the idea is to enclose a large area so that we can carry freely within it, because it's not owned by one person, but it's all enclosed. Mind you, there's an aspect of ownership, of common ownership as well, but that's not for now. So Reshut HaYachid is defined as an area of at least 4 handbreadths Tvachim, by 4 handbreadths at least, could be larger, surrounded by walls of at least 10 handbreadths high. And this includes a pit, which is 4 by 4 Tvachim in surface area, deep, walls deep of 10 Tvachim. That's also considered enclosed, either walls above ground or walls below ground, because it's dug into ground. You followed that? All right. Reshut HaRabim, public domain, is defined as a street which has to be 16, at least 16 amot wide. An amma is a cubit. And some authorities say that if there's not 600,000 people pass through it daily, it's not considered a biblical Reshut HaRabim. There aren't too many streets in the world that qualify. Fifth Avenue or Manhattan, I'm sure it does. In Hong Kong and other largely populated cities, there would be a domain that falls under this category. It's that wide and this great number of people passing through it at 600,000. Now, where does this number come from? Because that was the army age and the number of Jews in the desert between the ages of 20 and 60. Anyway, lots of detail. But here's the 2 primary domains, enclosed and very open in public. And the Torah prohibits the carrying of an object from one place to the other. And then there's two other domains. Commonly, there's a hybrid between these two, which the sages forbade carrying to or from because of the fear of confusion in the public mind. And then there's the fourth, a makom ptur, which is a small surface area less than 4 handbreadths wide, but at least 3 handbreadths high. This would be, for example, in the public domain, a pillbox, a post box. So you could take an object in the public domain and put it on a post box because it's not considered a private domain because it's too small, just to give you some insight. Now let's go back to the Mishnah that we are going to look at. So with this background, let's begin. Now, our study of the Mishnah and then some spiritual insight. Now, just to remind you, the reason why some words are in bold and other words are not, that's because the bold is a direct translation of the Hebrew, and the unbold, the not bold, is the translators weaving words of commentary so that the reader will understand the meaning of the text. Now, I want to answer now for a moment why the laws of Shabbat begin with the law of carrying. So one of the reasons is precisely because it doesn't fall under the category of nothing's changed. All of the other 39, there is a perceptible change that you've done. You've made a fire, you have plowed, you have reaped, you have pruned, you have written something, you have built something, you have dismantled something in order to build. You can see change. When you're carrying, there's no change. You took the handkerchief from indoors to outdoors. Now, because people would perhaps treat this law lightly, considering I can carry my handkerchief or any object in the house, and it's so easy just to carry it outside the house. So this is one of the reasons that the very first law deals with this, the prohibition of carrying, because it's the easiest one to overlook or treat lightly. But at the end of our discussion, friends, tonight, God willing, I will share with you a profound insight culled from the teachings of Chassidut that explain not only why this law is the opening law of the laws of Shabbat, but how this law encapsulates the heart and soul of what Shabbat is all about, beyond even that which I shared with you at the outset of this lesson. But let's look at the law. The Mishnah says the acts of carrying out from a public domain into a private domain or vice versa, which are prohibited on Shabbat, are primarily two basic actions. By that we mean there are two things you could do by which one would be liable biblically, having transgressed biblical law, but that comprises 4 cases, because there are another 2 cases that the sages had forbidden, all right, which we'll look at in a moment. Now, 2, which are 4, in other words, 2 serious transgressions, plus another 2, which the sages also prohibited for fear of confusion. From the perspective of a person inside a private domain, we'll look at the person who's inside the house, and the same model, 2 basic actions that comprise 4 cases from the perspective of a person outside in a public domain. Let's now illustrate. The Mishnah elaborates, how do these 8 cases take place? In order to answer that question, the Mishnah cites cases involving a poor person and a homeowner. Now, the reason the Mishnah chooses this is, first of all, for brevity of language. In Hebrew, Ashir and Ani. Ashir means really wealthy. Balabayit and Ani, homeowner and poor person. That's easier to say than the one on the inside and one on the outside. But also to tell you that even if you think you're giving tzedakah, you're doing a mitzvah. This will be a case where you're giving something to the poor person. You cannot do it in this way on Shabbat. You invite him into your house by all means. But to give him, as we'll see, from the enclosed domain to the open domain, that would be a prohibition. And let's see how things pan out. So here is the scenarios, 8 scenarios in total. Scenario 1, the poor person stands outside in the public domain, and the homeowner stands inside in the private domain. That doesn't change in all of the scenarios, obviously, right? So we have, the 2 domains we're concerned with. The enclosed one, that's the home, and the poor person is standing out there on Fifth Avenue, and you've got your apartment right there right there. He's on the sidewalk, and this is what happens. Scenario 1: the poor person lifted an object in the public domain, so he lifted a basket, extended his hand into the private domain, and so with the basket in hand, he puts it into the private through the window and placed the object into the hand of the homeowner. And so now he takes his basket and he places it into the hand of the homeowner. So you need to understand that. I didn't say this before. In order to violate, as it were, the prohibition of carrying, it's not only from you've got to carry from an enclosed to an open area. There's 2 other factors. You have to yourself actually lift it up and place it down, which is exactly what happened here. The poor person lifted the basket, put his hands through inside the private domain, and placed the basket on the rich man's hands. The poor person did both acts. He lifted the basket and he placed it down. In that case, the poor person performed the prohibition of carrying from the public domain into the private domain in its entirety. Why it's in entirety? Because he both lifted up and placed down. Is that clear? Case number 2. Or the poor person reached his hand into the private domain, took an item from the hand of the homeowner. He took a piece of bread, so he lifted it there in the private domain, carried it out into the public domain, and there he has it. So in that case too, the poor person performed the prohibition of prohibited labor of carrying out from the private domain into the public domain in its entirety. Because in both cases, he lifted and placed down. Either he started outside going in, or the process began inside taking out. We're clear? And therefore, he is liable, and the homeowner is exempt in these 2 cases because the homeowner did nothing. Everything was done by the poor person. Now, the Mishnah cites 2 additional cases. In these, they're similar, but the prohibited labor is performed by the homeowner who is in the private domain. What happened in these 2 scenarios? In these 2 scenarios we're about to describe, it's the poor person who's passive, and everything is done by the homeowner. What's the case? The homeowner lifted an item, a piece of bread, in the private domain, extended his hand into the public domain where the poor person is standing, and placed the object into the hand of the poor person. So he did both. Akira, which means lifted up, and hanacha, placed down. He lifted up in the private, placed it in the public. In that case, the homeowner performed the labor of carrying out from the private domain into the public domain in its entirety. For in this scenario, unlike the first 2 cases, it's the homeowner who does everything, and the poor person is passive. Or, again, in the similar case of the first 2, the homeowner reached his hand into the public domain. So the poor person standing there holding his basket. He's not carrying it, he's just holding it. The rich man, homeowner, takes the object from the hand of the poor person, carried it into the private domain, again, picked up and placed it down. In that case, the homeowner performed the labor of carrying from the public domain into the private domain in its entirety. In both cases, because the homeowner performed the prohibited labor in its entirety, he is liable and the poor person is exempt. Are we clear, friends? Now, the Mishnah goes on to describe a case where each one did a half. Let's just look at it. So these are the 2 classic cases that apply to the one on the inside and the one on the outside. 2 cases where your performed the labor entirely. Either you picked up here and placed down there, or you picked up here and placed down, picked up there and placed down here. And it's either the poor person or the homeowner. But there's a scenario where each one does a half, which the Torah did not prohibit, but the sages did, again, for fear of confusion. So there are 4 additional cases where neither the homeowner nor the poor person performed the labor in its entirety, and therefore neither is liable, but still shouldn't be done. What's the scenario? Here we go. The poor person extended his hand into the private domain. So that's all he did. He just put his hand there. He's not holding anything. And either the homeowner took an object from his hand, so he did hold something, but he didn't put it down. The homeowner took it and placed it in the private domain, or he had nothing in his hand and the homeowner placed an object into the hand of the poor person. And the poor person carried the object out in the public domain. In those cases, and the two that follow, the act of transferring the object from one domain to another was performed jointly by 2 people. Again, jointly, because to do the act in its entirety, you've got to both pick up and place down. So in these scenarios, the poor person and the homeowner did it jointly because each performed only a part of the prohibited labor. Both of them are exempt biblically. So the Mishnah concludes, in the case where the homeowner extended his hand into the public domain, and either the poor person took the bread, he didn't place it down, it was taken from him, from the homeowner's hand and placed it in the public domain, or the homeowner put his hand out, it was empty, and the poor person placed an object into the homeowner's hand, and the homeowner carried it into the private domain, since he didn't pick it up in the public domain, because each performed only a part of the prohibited labor. Both of them are exempt. Hope you got the basic idea. All right. So what I want to do now is explain on a deeper level what's going on here and why, what's the problem with carrying altogether? How is carrying demonstrating man's mastery over nature? Again, there's no change here. The object was here, now the object is here. I mean, look at the details of what's required in order to complete a labor. But what's the whole meaning behind it? So one explanation is this, friends. It's very symbolic. You know what it symbolizes? Commerce. Commerce is the interaction between the public domain and the private domain, the marketplace and the consumer. So taking an object from private domain to the public, or the public to the private, is symbolic of business and commerce, something we don't do on Shabbat. That's one explanation of the symbolism of this law. But now, friends, I'm going to go deeper. And if we have time, I would even like to examine these laws in their detail, not just the general idea, and how they convey profound spiritual description and insight. I'll just tell you this and whet your appetite. But on the spiritual level, the homeowner is the Almighty, and we are all the poor person. And the Mishnah describes 8 scenarios of relationship between us and God, all symbolized by this transfer of an object in one way or another from our world to God's world. If we have time, we'll be able to address the details of this Mishnah. But first, let's give the general Kabbalistic, spiritual, Hasidic insight into the whole underpinnings of the law of carrying, and why then it is the opening law, the first law of the tractate, because it encapsulates the essence of Shabbat. And that, my friends, is as follows. We started saying earlier in our description of Shabbat, it's God's invitation to enter into a transcendent place, to dine, as it were, at the divine table. There's a famous story in the Talmud where the gist of it is that a foreign king had occasion to spend Shabbat at the home of one of the sages. And the fare was so delicious that he asked that the recipe or the recipes for the recipes, so the food could be replicated and produced back home in his country, in his palace. And the recipes were duly furnished. But that followed with a complaint that you must have omitted an ingredient, a spice, because it doesn't taste the same. To which the sage responded, the ingredients are precisely the same. The spice you seek is Shabbat itself. And that can't be replicated. And we all know this, friends, from our own experience. The same food during the week is simply not the same on Shabbat. What is it about Shabbat that is so transformative? And what is the essence of Shabbat? So friends, the deeper meaning of the Reshut HaYachid, see where my mouse is? The private domain, let's translate that even more accurately and reveal its deeper meaning. Reshut HaYachid means the domain of the singular one, the absolute one, and that's God. Reshut HaRabim means the domain of the many. What this means, friends, is this. I'm going to give you now a definition of holiness. What's holiness? Who is a holy person? And what is the hallmark of holiness? It is this. Where there is holiness, there is oneness and unity. In the absence of holiness, there is division and strife. And that's because holiness is where God is revealed. All comes from him, friends. All of creation is God's. The problem is we don't feel that because God, by divine design, conceals his presence in creation. And as a result of God concealing his presence, the result is a sense of separation. We don't feel that we are created by him. We don't feel, in fact, the deeper truth that we're being constantly created by him. We feel independent and separate, and therein lies the source of all conflict. And the more God is concealed, the greater the sense of self and separation. So where God is concealed, the result is division. Each creation, each person, each thing experiences itself and nothing else. Independent of all other things, and certainly independent of the divine force that in truth is constantly bringing us into being. This is the deeper meaning of the public domain. The public domain means it's not unified. It's a world of competition. It's the survival of the fittest. It's the domain where I perceive every other person as a threat until negotiated, and then I'll see whether I'll allow him or him or her into my orbit. But everything and everyone is treated with suspicion. Why? Because I feel me, and that's my primary concern, is my own preservation and pleasure. You, if you can enhance my pleasure, you're welcome into my world. And if not, I will exclude you. And if need be, I will eliminate you. The cause of all conflict, the root of all evil in the world is the ego. And the ego can only emerge when the presence of God is concealed. For if God were to be revealed and we were all to feel, we all come from the one creator. It's all the result of his will. Nothing has independent reality. He's creating everything at every moment. Then we'd experience this deep oneness with each other. There wouldn't be envy or competition, but harmony and oneness. So friends, Shabbat is the opportunity to experience that truth. To be lifted to a place where we feel all of creation as being Reshut HaYachid, the domain of the one, the creator, the absolute one. We would feel all of creation in God's embrace, enclosed. That's what the experience of Shabbat is. And that's why the first law is, don't carry anything from the enclosed domain to the public domain. Don't break out of the spiritual cocoon of Shabbat. Remain for 24 hours elevated, ensconced in the perfect harmony and embrace of the divine, wherein, at least temporarily until Mashiach comes, when it'll all be Shabbat, at least on this Shabbat, we have a taste of the oneness of creation. Don't break out of it. This is, friends, I hope we're grasping this, if I'm conveying this accurately. Why is the first law of all the hundreds of laws, 39 labors, all right, but they break down into hundreds of thousands of details. Why is the first of the law not to carry from the enclosed to the open? Because that's the essence of Shabbat. Don't break out of this world and enter into the world of division and competition, the world of the many, multiplicity. Remain in the world of oneness. And how do we remain in the world of oneness? The observance of the law, starting with the prohibition to carry even a handkerchief from an enclosed area to an open area. It's profoundly symbolic and spiritual. It's the awareness that on this day we are elevated to a higher place. And of course, after Shabbat, we make Havdalah, and we make sure that the wine spills over the top of our Kiddush cup or a Havdalah cup into the plate below, because we want to bring that sanctity, that awareness, that understanding into the weekday. To truly experience Shabbat means that after Shabbat, I'm inspired to bring that unity wherever I go. How do I do that? Because I see the divine in every other human being. I see the divine in all of creation. I don't see the world as a place that needs to be negotiated, overcome, that I need to protect myself from, or that I need to swallow up. I see the world as a divine expression of God. And every mitzvah I do reveals that truth until one day the whole world will be Shabbat. The end of war, envy, strife, competition, and illness. Every Shabbat we plug into the Messianic era. What's the Messianic era? A unified, united world. The only way there can be unity, friends, if there's a common transcendent truth that embraces us all equally. And that's if there's a creator. For if there's no creator, then things that are bigger, stronger, have more value than things that are smaller and weaker, because they're bigger, they're cleverer, they're more powerful. There cannot be equality if we just look at the value of things or people per se, because we are different. But we understand that we all come from one God, and all for the same purpose of revealing his presence on earth. It's in that there lies the only and ultimate unity. And that's Shabbat. The whole world in God's embrace. It's temporary. There's work to be done during the week to bring that divine awareness, mitzvah by mitzvah, example by example. But every Shabbat we get that inspiration. We get that inoculation. We get that energy. We get that blessing, that taste, that foretaste of the Messianic era. No wonder we're loath or we resist when Shabbos ends. We have to make a special meal. It's called the Mlava Malka. The Mlava Malka is a meal whereby we accompany the Shabbos queen or bride as she leaves. The idea being we bring her aura. Shabbos is about being, remember? We bring her aura into the weekday. So that's the general idea. I hope I've been successful in conveying this. Why the first law is this carrying business, open area, closed area, because that's what Shabbat is all about. And that's the whole mission of the Jew, is to make the whole world Shabbat, the whole world to be the Reshut HaYachid, the domain of the Absolute One, and all of existence experiencing that truth, harmonious and united. Now, I'd mentioned earlier, and I'll just address this for the last remaining minutes that we have, that the Mishnah described 4 scenarios. Now, what were the scenarios? So there's the poor fella who's on the outside, and the Balabai, the owner that's on the inside. Spiritually, symbolically, we had mentioned earlier, this is God, is the homeowner, and it is you and I who are in this world, the outside world, the world of multiplicity, until we transform it. Now, the whole discussion here is an object going from the outside in or the inside out, correct? That's the whole discussion. 8 scenarios. 8 scenarios. 2 scenarios for each of the 2 players, where each one does the entire labor, and then 2 scenarios for each one of them, where each one does part of the labor. What's the spiritual significance? So really, I kind of conveyed this now. There's Shabbat, and then there's the Havdalah. See, a Jew, we're fond of saying this, truth comes in paradox. What's demanded of us, friends, is, on the one hand, to desire transcendence, on the other hand, to be fully engaged in the world. Now, transcendence, if you can see where is this way, engagement is this way. Both things are required. Shabbat is transcendence. The weekday, which begins with the Havdalah, is about engaging, bringing it all down. So the scenarios, friends, here are where the Jew, you and I, on the outside. The first 2 scenarios are where the poor person himself, that's you and I, either extending into the private domain or successfully bringing from the private domain outside. This describes the tzaddik. This describes the Jew who successfully balances the desire for transcendence and God's will, that with that transcendence, with that experience, we then re-engage the world and bring it down. That's this movement that the poor person does successfully and completely. Going in, bringing something in, or bringing something out. And the Mishnah says, in that case, the poor person is liable. What that means spiritually is, where's the word here? The poor person performed in its entirety. Liable means continue doing that. Liable means you're obligated. That's a wonderful model to constantly engage in this dual movement of, like the heart, expanding and contracting, pumping the blood out, receiving the blood. If one can maintain this balance, this harmonious balance of the Shabbos and the weekday, the Kiddush and the Friday night, the Kiddush Friday night and the Havdalah of Saturday night, transcendence, ascent and descent, liable, continue it. The other extreme was where we're not capable of anything. The poor person, that's you and I, stand on the outside, mute, and it's the master of the house that is either bringing from what we have in or taking what's in and bringing it out. And in that case, the Mishnah said, the land, the homeowner is liable if a Jew is not capable, the Mishnah declares, of either transcendence or engagement, but only wants to, he's standing there hopefully and expectantly, then dear God, you must provide. Then you must provide and help us in our transcendence and help us in our engagement. So in that case, who is liable? Who is obligated to continue this model thereafter? The homeowner. If indeed we find ourselves uninspired and incapable, but one thing is desired, stand there by the window. I just can't summon the strength to be able to disengage the world and observe Shabbos. And I can't seem, once I've touched Shabbos, once I've touched that, to be able to bring that into the world. So the Mishnah says, you stand by the window, the homeowner is liable. He's chayiv, he's obligated. God will help me that I should be able to have the strength to observe the Shabbat and then afterwards bring the Shabbat's message into the world. And the last two cases of the Mishnah were in the various scenarios where it's a partnership. God does part and man does part. And that relationship also, of course, has its place, and each one is obligated to the degree that they're obligated. There's much more detailed, obviously, to the spiritual dimension, but I do hope that we had a sense of what this law of carrying is all about. We had a sense of the Mishnah at its depth, speaks not simply of a homeowner and a poor person and a basket going in or out or bread, but it's really our relationship with God that involves these dual movements of ascent and descent, transcendence and engagement. Conclusion of our discussion tonight is, there's a famous Yiddish saying, and it goes like this: more than the Jews kept Shabbat, Shabbat kept the Jews. Like anything in life, friends, from the outside looking in, it seems like a daunting task. So many prohibitions, and I can't do this and I can't do the other. But as every one of you that has experienced Shabbat wholly and devotedly, once and a second and a third time, one reaches the point when I just don't understand how I ever lived without Shabbat. And we can't wait for Shabbat to come. For it's the time that energizes us, that nurtures the soul within, that nurtures relationships. It's about connecting to each other, not through shared activities or performance, but to connect to you because of you. It's about being, it's the feminine day. And so nourished and so connected, we then bring that, God willing, into all of our engagements and relationships during the week. May God grant that very soon we experience the day which is complete Shabbat. That's a repeated refrain in our Shabbat prayers, both in the prayers and in the grace after meals that we say at the conclusion of our Shabbat meals. We say, Harachamon, may the All-Merciful One, Hu Yanchilenu, may He bequeath us the Yom Shekulo Shabbat U'Menucha, the day that is all Shabbat and tranquility, L'chayu Alamim, for life everlasting. We don't mean souls in heaven disembodied from the body. It means here peace on earth, the great Shabbat for the Jewish people and all humanity. May we merit that without delay. All right, friends, so this concludes our Mishnah series. God willing, we'll be in touch with you by email about future series, perhaps on different subjects. Please stay tuned. It was a pleasure having you all. I hope you learned a lot. And I hope that reviewing these texts will remind you of that which we discussed today.